Hi students, you took your 2-1 to 2-8 quiz today, so I'm going to go through every problem, try to make sure that I explain it completely to help prepare you for your tests. Please let me know if you have any further questions when we get to class, or you're welcome to bring those to tutoring. So number 1 is one of those problems where you want to translate the sentence directly into an equation, and we're going to do it piece by piece. So it's the first sentence says, the measure of the supplement of an angle is 7 times the measure of the complement of the angle. So anytime we see the expression measure of the supplement of an angle, that just really means the supplement. And what we always want to use to represent the supplement is 180 minus x. So that's the first thing. The next word is is. Is will always translate to an equal sign. The is going to divide your equation into 2 halves. So whatever's before is will go before the equal sign. Whatever is after the word is will go after the equal sign. The next part says 7 times. So we're going to have the number 7 times something. And then the last part is the measure of the complement of the angle. That all means the complement. And what we always use to represent the complement is 90 minus x. I want you to remember that supplement is what you add to something to get 180. So to figure out what that something is, you always subtract it from 180. And complement is very similar. It's what you add to something to equal 90. So to figure out what it equals, you would subtract it from 90. And that would tell you the complement. So once you have your equation, you're going to solve it. When we're done solving, then we'll figure out the next part. So to solve, the first thing we want to do is distribute that 7. So 180 minus x equals 7 times 90 is 630. 7 times minus x is minus 7x, or negative 7x. Now we want to get all of our variables on the same side. It doesn't matter which side, but I generally like to move the variables to where there are more variables, or where the coefficient is a larger number, so that we end up with a positive coefficient. We have negative 1x on the left, we have negative 7x on the right. Negative 1 is actually greater than negative 7, so I'm going to move the negative 7 to the left side by adding it to both sides. If I wanted to move the negative x to the other side, I can add x to both sides. It would be just as good. So the 180 does not combine with the 7x, but the negative 1x combines with the 7x to make 6x, and that equals 630. Now all of our x's are on one side. I'm going to move all the constants to the other side, so I'm going to move this 180 over by subtracting it from both sides. So 6x equals 450. And the very last thing you usually do is divide, so I'm going to divide by that 6 that's in front of the x to get rid of that 6. And when I do that, I get a value for x that equals 75. What I need y'all to remember, though, is when you solve these type of equations, the x represents the angle. So the next part of the problem says find the measure of half the complement. When I was grading this quiz, a lot of students just took half of the angle, or half of 75. But what we first have to do is figure out what's the complement of 75 and then take half of that. So we're going to take half of the complement. Complement is 90 minus x. Anytime you take half of something, you're always going to be multiplying. So we want to put that 75 up here where the x is to find the complement first. 90 minus 75 is 15. And then when we take half of 15, we get 7.5. So as I was grading this quiz, I gave you partial points. So for example, if you got the equation correct, you got 4 points. If you got this to the 75, you got another 3 points. And then if you got to the 7.5, you got your remaining 3 points for a total of 10 points for this problem. Whenever you're doing these problems, like on number 2, and you're given a list of givens, make sure that you read every given and try to put that information on your picture so you can see it. If there's one given that you do not read, it's going to affect the way that you answer the question. Every given is given to you for a reason. So the first thing it says is that ray OP bisects angle MOE. And I know whenever I bisect something, I'm creating two smaller congruent things, which means these two smaller angles are congruent, and that's very, very important for understanding this problem. We also know that the measure of angle MOP is 2x plus 3y, so I'm going to put that in that angle. And then the measure of angle POE is y plus 10. It says solve for y in terms of x. I've got two variables. I know whenever I solve for y in terms of x or x in terms of y, I just need to create one equation and get that variable that I'm solving for by itself. So I need to think, how can I make one equation from what I know? Well, I know I've got two congruent angles. I have expressions for each of those. Whenever you have two things that are congruent and you have expressions that represent them, you can put an equal sign between those expressions to represent that they are actually equal, their values, their measures. So we can say the measure of angle MOP, which is 2x plus 3y, is equal to the measure of angle POE, which is y plus 10. And I know those measures are equal because those angles are congruent. So now I just have to solve for y in terms of x. That means get y by itself on one side. So the first thing I need to do is get my y's on the same side. So I'm thinking the easiest thing might be to subtract this y from both sides to get them on the left. So I've got 2x plus 2y equals 10. Now that I've got my y's on the left, I need to get my 2x on the other side. I got to move it over, so I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. Anytime you want to move a term from one side to the other, you're either going to add or subtract it to both sides. Now the minus 2x and the 10 are not like terms, so I can't put them together. So it's appropriate to put either one before the other. I think many of y'all are probably used to putting your x term before your constant term, just because you're used to putting these equations in slope-intercept form. The very last thing, a lot of students get stuck here, is I need to get rid of that coefficient in front of the y, the 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide both sides by 2. On the right side, I've got two terms. I'm going to divide both terms by 2. You can't just pick and choose which terms you're dividing by 2. It's got to be all of them. So what we're left with is y on the left. I'm going to come up here. This negative 2 over 2 will reduce to negative 1. And if I have a coefficient of 1, I really don't need to write it. So I could just write it as minus x, or negative x. And then 10 over 2 simplifies to 5. So this is y in terms of x. This is the value of y in terms of x. Now if you had chosen to put the 5 first, it means exactly the same thing. So this answer is also acceptable. Okay, let's look at number 3. We've got 4 givens. We need to make sure to put all of this information on our picture. Very good habit to get into. Somebody during the quiz asked me about angle W because we're used to seeing angles represented with 3 letters. Well, angle W is going to be this angle over here, and because it's the only angle that has vertex W, we can just call it by the vertex letter. Now, angle T, if you look at T, T has multiple angles coming off of it. So in those cases, we would need to use the 3 letters to be specific about which angle T we're talking about. But the first given says angle W is congruent to angle STV. Angle STV is here, angle W is there. I'm going to show that they're congruent with tick marks. We're also told that ray TV bisects angle STV. Remember, whenever we bisect something, we have 2 congruent smaller parts, which means that this angle that I've already put an arc through is going to be congruent to this angle. And if you look at our picture, we now have 3 angles that have been marked with arcs, which means they are all congruent. So this is really important for us to know. All 3 of those angles are congruent. We're also told that angle W equals 2x minus 5. So that goes right here. And we're told that angle VTW equals x plus 15. That goes here. So just like in the last example, I've got 2 angles that are congruent, and I have expressions for each of them. Let's put an equal sign between them. x plus 15 equals 2x minus 5. Those two angles are congruent. Now we need to find the measure of angle STW, but in order for us to do that, we first need to get a value for x. That's why we're going to create an equation. So let's go ahead and solve this equation to get a value for x, and then we can go back and plug it in. I'm going to get all my variables on one side. I'm choosing the right side for my x's, so I'm going to subtract x from one side. 2x minus x, or minus 1x, is just x. Then I'm going to move my constants to the other side, so I'm going to add this 5 to both sides. And we're going to get that x has a value of 20. Great. Now, to find the measure of angle STW, it's this big angle right here, it's actually made up of this angle and this angle, these two smaller angles. And if you remember, they are congruent. So one of them is represented with the expression x plus 15. If I can evaluate one of them, then I could double it, and now I have the size of angle STW. So the measure of angle STW is really going to be equal to 2 of the x plus 15s. So we're going to replace x with 20. Plus 15 is 35, so that means each of those angles that make up STW, because they're congruent, they both equal 35, but now I need to multiply that by 2, or 35 plus 35, and I will get 70 degrees for the measure of angle STW. Okay, after grading the quiz, a lot of people struggled with this problem. You really have to look at those givens and think about, what does this mean? It's actually much easier than a lot of you figured out. Maybe you weren't looking at it from the right perspective. So let's take a look at these givens. It says segment VS is congruent to segment VR. This side and this side have the same length, and that's really important to remember. It says segment WT bisects segment VS and VR. So those two segments, which were congruent, is being cut in half by this guy, which means each of them now have two congruent smaller segments, and because the two larger segments or original segments were congruent, all 4 of those halves will be congruent when I cut them in half. If I have 2 things that are equal in length and I cut both of them in half, then now I have 4 halves that are all congruent. And that's really important to remember, and a lot of students didn't get to that point. So it says find the perimeter of triangle VRS. Well, in order to do that, I need to find the length of all of the sides. And right now, I have a couple expressions. I have x's and I have y's. So a lot of students started off by saying y plus 5 equals 2x. That's great. But if you're trying to work smarter here and not harder, you would want to put the two expressions together that have the same variable so that you can just immediately solve it. This 2x over here and this x plus 4 are the same length because all 4 of those halves are congruent. So the best way to get started would just be to say 2x equals x plus 4 and then solve this very simple equation for x. To solve it, I'm going to subtract x on both sides. 2x minus 1x is x, so x equals 4. Super simple. Now that I know that x is 4, I can go back to my picture and I could plug it in anywhere I see an x. So for length WR, if I put a 4 where the x is, 4 plus 4 is 8. I know this side is 8. And what's cool about that, since all 4 of those halves were congruent, that means all of these little mini segments over here equal 8. I have almost all of the sides of my triangle figured out. The side I haven't figured out yet is this 6y. So I'm going to need to go back to the equation and find the expression that has y, which is this y plus 5, and figure out what y equals. Well, I know the length VW has to equal 8 because it's congruent to the other halves, and it has the expression y plus 5. So I can say y plus 5 equals 8. And then I can work backwards by subtracting 5 from both sides to find out that y has a value of 3. And some people just did that in their head. They're like, oh, y is 3. Now that I know that y is 3, I can plug it into the 6y at the bottom. 6 times 3 is 18. So now I've got to find the perimeter of this triangle. I'm going to add 8, 8, 18, 8, and 8. Or 8 times 4, because I've got 4 8s, plus the 18. 8 times 4 is 32. 32 plus 18 gives us a perimeter of 50. Awesome. All right, for number 5, my suggestion in class was to draw a picture. And for a lot of students, they tried to draw a picture, which was fantastic. But the variable, or sorry, not the variables, the vertices or the points used in the angles were messing people up. What's important here is the relationship between the angles, not what their names are. Okay? So what I want you to notice from the first 2 givens, they both have angle QRS. Okay? Let me get a different color here. Okay. Now, angle QRS is supplementary to angle PQR, and it's also supplementary to angle TWX. So you have to really think about what that means. If 2 different angles are supplementary to the same angle, which means they're both going to add with angle QRS to equal 180, that means that angle PQR and angle TWX must be the same size. These 2 angles right here must be equal because they're both adding with angle QRS to get 180. That was the big thing that you needed to figure out here. A lot of students wanted to add these 2 angles to equal 180. Well, that's not the relationship here. So once I figure out the relationship, now it's easy. When 2 things are congruent, I can just put an equal sign between their expressions. Okay, so let's go ahead and solve this equation. We're going to move our x's to the same side. I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides so I can get them on the left. That's just the way I'm choosing to start. Oops, undo. And then that minus 48, I want to move over to the 30 so it's on the other side. So I'm going to add it to both sides. (3x) equals 78. Now I'm going to divide both sides by 3. And I get an x value of 26. So let's think about what this means. This is just the value of x. The question wants to know what's the measure of angle QRS. Well, QRS, remember, is the angle that we added to these 2 guys to equal 180. So if I can figure out how much one of those 2 guys are, and I know that they're both congruent, right? Then I can subtract that measure from 180 to find the measure of angle QRS. So the measure of angle QRS is going to be equal to 180 minus either the measure of either of those 2 angles. They're congruent, so I can choose either one. I'm going to choose the TWX. So I'm going to evaluate the TWX, which is 2x plus 30. Oh dear. Sorry, it's going off the paper a little. I'll scoot it over. I'm going to plug in this 26 where the x is. So 180 minus 2 times 26 plus 30. 2 times 26 is 52. 52 plus 30 is 82. When I was grading the quiz, a lot of students said that 82 was the answer. Remember, 82 is just the measure of these 2 angles that I've highlighted up here with yellow, right? I could have, instead of 2x plus 30, I could have used the 5x minus 48. I still would have gotten 82. But now I need to find the measure of QRS, which is its supplement. So that's why I'm subtracting it from 180, and I will get 98 degrees. Okay, this problem was one of the trickier ones on the quiz for sure. One thing I want to just say right off the bat is angle APD is not a right angle. A lot of students said it was a right angle. Not at all. We don't know that. Could be. We don't know that. But let's look at what we do know. We know that the measure of angle APB, which is this guy, is congruent to angle DPC, which is very important to know. We also see there's an angle between them as well. Okay, so there are two different ways you could come up with an equation here. We got to find the measure of angle APD, but in order to do that, we need to find the value of x. And we have a couple expressions here that have x in them, so we need to come up with an equation. You could think of this two ways. You could put those two congruent angles equal to each other. So for angle APB, since it's x plus 23, you could say x plus 23 equals angle DPC. If you look at it, we don't have an expression for this angle, but we have an expression for an angle that includes that. This angle right here is 4x minus 39. If I take this x away from it, then I will be left with angle DPC. So if I take the 4x minus 39 and I subtract off that angle that has the value of x, then I'll be left with angle DPC. So this is one way you could set up your equation. The other way you could set up your equation is by looking at sums of angles. So for example, I have an expression for 4x minus, I have the expression 4x minus 39 to represent angle BPD. Now BPD is made up of that congruent angle that's congruent to angle APB plus the x. Okay, so I'm adding this angle and this angle together and I get 4x minus 39. Now that's going to be equal to the other congruent angle, angle APB, also plus this x, because I'm adding the same amount to two angles that are already congruent. So the other congruent angle is x plus 23, but I want to add that middle angle, the x, to it so that it has the same size as the angle that's expressed with 4x minus 39. When you're setting up these equations, you need to make sure that the equation makes sense. So this equation is basically this angle plus this angle, or sorry, equals this angle. And those two actually do equal because I have two congruent angles and I'm adding x to both of them. Okay, I've completely marked up my picture. So now you get to choose one of these equations. It doesn't matter. And if you look at the equations, they're very similar. The only difference is this guy and this guy. It's the same thing. In the first equation, it's being subtracted from the 4x minus 39. In the other equation, it's being added to the x plus 23 side, but if I moved it over with the 4x minus 39, it would be subtracted and it would look exactly like the first equation. So these equations really are equivalent. It doesn't matter which one I start with. So let's just start with one. I'm going to start with the bottom one because I've already written it. So the very first thing I want to do is combine some like terms. I've got two x's on the right, so I'm going to have 4x minus 39 still on the left. If I add my two 1x's together, I'm going to get 2x plus 23. Now I'm going to move all my variables to the same side. So I'm going to choose to subtract 2x from both sides to get them on the left. So 4x minus 2x is 2x. And then I want to move that minus 39 to the other side. So I'm going to do that by adding 39 to both sides. And 2x equals 62. And then the last thing is to get rid of the 2 by dividing, because that's the inverse operation of multiplying. And x equals 31. Now that I've got the value of x, I can figure out the answer. So the question says, find the measure of angle APD. So we need to really look back at our picture. I'm going to erase some things really quick. Okay, so the measure of angle APD is this big angle, and it's made up of three smaller angles. Now remember, these two angles are congruent, right? So if I look at my expressions, I don't want to evaluate all three expressions and add them up because some of these expressions represent angles that overlap. And so I would be counting some of the angles twice. So I would be counting this middle angle twice. What I can do though is I can see that this angle plus this angle will equal angle APD. And I can just ignore this little x guy for the time being because he's a part of the 4x minus 39 angle. So that's what I'm going to do. So the measure of angle APD is going to be equal to the x plus 23 angle plus the 4x minus 39 degree angle. And so we're going to replace both of our x's with 31. And we'll get something like this. 31 plus 23 plus 4 times 31 minus 39. You can just plug all this into your calculator or you can do it by hand. But what you're going to get, this angle is going to equal 54. This angle is going to equal 85. And then when you add those up, you get 139 degrees. And that's it. Alright, there was a homework problem kind of like this. I think maybe exactly like this. There are two things going on here. Two angles are supplementary and they're congruent. So you just have to think about what those two things mean. If they're supplementary, they add to 180. So a lot of times we'll draw a picture like this, right? If they're congruent, they have the same measure. Okay, well it's going to change a little bit in my picture. Those two angles that add up to 180 have to have the same measure. There's only one measure that those angles can both be. They have to both be 90 degrees. So if I put my box here and here, then that would represent it. Now, of course, my picture is not drawn to scale because I was just sketching it to get an understanding of what the problem says. It says, what type of angle is each? Well, they're both right angles. And that's it. If you said they were 90-degree angles, that would represent their measure or their size. When I say type, I want to know the kind of angle. So in this case, it would be right. But if you put 90 degrees, I'll give you that. Okay, I feel like y'all are getting pretty good with these ratio problems. So we have angles 1, 2, and 3. I can see from my picture that they're supplementary. They're going to add up to 180 because together they form this straight line. They are in the ratio of 2 to 4 to 3 respectively. This word just means that I want to keep the same order for these as I have up here. They're going to match. So angle 1 is going to go with the 2. Angle 2 is going to go with the 4. Angle 3 is going to go with the 3. So the way that we do these ratio problems, remember, is we just stick an x with each part of our ratio. So that 2 is going to become a 2x and it represents angle 1. The 4 is going to become a 4x and it represents angle 2. And the 3 is going to become a 3x and it represents angle 3. It's very simple to make an equation from here. Y'all done this lots by now. We're going to add up the three angles, 2x plus 4x plus 3x. And we know they add up to 180 degrees. So let's simplify. If I add up those three x terms, we're going to get 9x. And then if I divide both sides by 9, x has a value of 20. Okay, now it says find the measure of angle 2. Well, angle 2 is represented with this expression 4x. So all we need to do now that we know the value of x is replace it with 20. Hopefully by now you're seeing a theme with the problems that we see, that we've seen so far. And the theme is that we analyze a picture for the relationships in the picture. We label it with all the expressions and information we know. From there we try to say, okay, what equals what? And that's how we make our equation. Once we've come up with the equation, we'll usually solve it, get a value for x, and then we'll go back and plug it in somewhere to find whatever it is that it's asking for. So in this case, the measure of angle 2 equals 80 degrees. In this problem, we have an expression for two angles that are across from each other at an intersection. They intersect at, the two lines intersect at B, and because angle ABC, which is the 2x plus 10, and angle DBE, which is the 8x minus 8, share the same vertex and are across from each other, we know they are vertical angles, and vertical angles are always congruent. Their measures are always equal. That's where we want to start. Then we can come back and find the measure of angle ABD. But we always need to start with what we know and try to make an equation. Okay, so 2x plus 10 equals 8x minus 8. All right, let's move our x's to one side. I'm going to move the x's to the right this time. 8x minus 2x is 6x. I'm going to move my constants to the left by adding 8 to both sides. So 18 equals 6x. And then we're going to divide by that 6 to get the x by itself, and we'll get that x has a value of 3. Now, to find angle ABD. Angle ABD is supplementary with both of the angles that we have expressions for. So angle ABD plus this guy equal 180. So what we're going to have to do is evaluate either the 2x plus 10 or the 8x minus 8, and it doesn't matter because the angles are congruent. And then whatever we get from there, we're going to subtract it from 180 to get its supplement, which is angle ABD. So here's our plan. To find the measure of angle ABD, we're going to take 180, and from that we're going to subtract the measure of one of those angles that's already labeled with an expression. You can choose either one, 2x plus 10 or 8x minus 8. I'm going to do 2x plus 10. We're going to replace the x with 3, now that we know its value. So we have got 2 times 3 plus 10. 2 times 3 is 6. 6 plus 10 is 16. So 16, if you want to go back to your picture, is the measure of these two vertical angles. I need to figure out what its supplemented is. So I'm going to subtract from 180, and that's when we get 164 degrees. Make sure that you don't stop here, that you keep going. Always stay organized and keep track of what you're actually doing and why you're doing it. What does x represent? What am I trying to find? Alright, we saved the easy one for the end. This is actually a theorem you need to know. Vertical angles are always congruent. And we just talked about that in the last problem. So just to make sure everybody's understanding, these two angles are called vertical. They share a vertex. They're across from each other, so their angles are congruent. These two angles are also going to be congruent, so because they're also vertical. Alright, if there's any questions you still have over this quiz, send me a message, swing by my room, go to tutoring, ask me right before we take the test, and good luck studying. Let me know if y'all need anything. Love y'all.